Great. Good evening. Hope all of you are doing well. We're ready to get started. We're learning Maseches Succah, Daf Hey. We are starting. Where are we starting? 6 lines from the bottom of Dalet Amud Beis. Today we're going to be discussing one sugya with various parts, and that is the minimum height of a sukkah. We said that in our Mishnah that minimum height is 10 tvachim. So it asks the Gemara 6 lines from the bottom, quoting from our Mishnah, V'she'ena gvoa asar tvachim minalan. How do we know that this is true? From where do we know that 10 tvachim is the minimum height? Tosfos adds a critical ancillary point here. Take a look at the bottom Tosfos. Dibur hamaschel asar tvachim minalan. V'ha deba'ina nami gabe Shabbos mechitza asara mehacha yalfinon. Whatever the Mari Makomos are over here, says Tosfos, in regards to how we determine the minimum shiur for a sukkah, the same will be true for a minimum shiur for a mechitza for Shabbos. So that means if you're going to create some type of, a small little fence around your private property in the middle of a place that requires a mechitza, so then that's what you have to do, a minimum of 10 tvachim. What are the Mari Makomos for the 10? So says the Gemara Itmar. Itmar always reminds us that we're talking about Amoraim. And the Gemara that here quotes a group of 4, Rav, the Rabbi Chanina, the Rabbi Yochanan, the Rav Chaviva Masnu. They all taught the following, parentheses, the Gemara says, Bekule Seder Moed, when all of these names are mentioned throughout Seder Moed, Kolki Haizuga, whenever they're mentioned here as a group, Chilufe Rav Yochanan Uma'ila Rav Yonasan. We will take out the name of Rav Yochanan and we will put in the name of Rav Yonasan. But either way, whoever the 4 are, says the Gemara, 3 lines from the bottom, Dalet Amud Beis, Aron Tisha. We know that the Aron was 9 tfachim tall. It's based on the pasuk. The pasuk says it's Amma v'chetzi komaso, 1.5 in Amma. And if you multiply by 6 tfachim, 6 tfachim per amma, so 6 times 1.5 is 9. So the aron is tisha, the kapores tefach, and the covering on top of that was 1 tefach thick. Hare kana sara, 9 plus 1 is 10. Uchsiv, and on that note, says the Gemara, the pasuk says, where did HaKadosh Baruch Hu speak with us? V'no'adati lecha sham v'dibarti itecha me'ala kaporos. I'll speak with you on top of the kaporos, top of Hamid Aleph. The Tanya and the Brisa writes, Rabbi Yossi Omer me'olam lo yarda shchina lamata v'lo ala Moshe ve'Eliyahu lemaro. And not only did Hashem never go below that 10 tefach threshold, but Moshe and Eliyahu never went above it. Shneimar, as the pasuk says, Hashemayim shemayim l'Hashem v'aretz nasan livnei Adam. Period. That's the Gemara's first answer. The Gemara is presenting this idea that there's the Aron plus the Kaporos is 10, and Hashem is always above, and we are always below. Now, of course, we're all taller than 10 tvachim. It doesn't mean that. It just means that we are always on the ground. Our feet are on the ground. We're never off the ground more than 10 tvachim. Take a look at Rashi, because Rashi gets us into the lumdus of what is going on here. Why is it that this 9 plus 1 is 10? What is going on here? So Rashi says, the Kraksiv Dala Kaporos Yarad, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu came down on the Kabbar Shema Mina, Lamala Me'asara, Mifsaka Rishusa. Here we're getting into the language. Rashi gets us into the language of the lumdus, is that it's a hefsek rishus. We now consider 10 tvachim a rishus because the HaKadosh Baruch Hu stopped above 10 tvachim, which means that up to 10 is its own rishus. And that's how Rashi explains in lumdus the answer of our Gemara. But the Gemara has a slew of questions on this. We know stories. Moshe, all of the Maro, and we have all these stories about Eliyahu, and we know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu came down to Har Sinai, and all of these questions are posed here. Daf Hey Amud Aleph, 4 lines down. V'lo yarda shchina lamata. What are you talking about? The Shechina did come down. Says the Gemara, V'haksiv v'yered Hashem al Har Sinai. It's a great question. He came down to Har Sinai. He says, yeah, he came down to Har Sinai, but lamala me'asar tvachim. It was above 10 tvachim, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu was still above in his rishus, as it were. And then the Gemara says,
why is there a hekesh between the Aron and the height of your sukkah? I mean, what's the hekesh?
Other than establishing a rishus, nothing. That was the whole point of this Rashi. Rashi's second line, Lamala me'asara mifsaka rishusa. We have to define a rishus. That sukkah is halachically defined as a rishus when it's 10 tvachim. That's how Rashi explains this Gemara. You're asking a great question in lumdus, because what does one thing have to do with the other? It's correct. In logic, they don't. We're not looking for logic of, therefore it applies by sukkah. We're looking for the category of a rishus. That's what Tosfos on the bottom of Dalet Amud Beis is talking about as well. We need to know, how do we create a separation of outside my private property to inside my private property? 10. Mifsak Rishus. So similar ideas both in Rashi and Tosfos, but from different lenses. So that was question 1 that we asked. HaKadosh Baruch Hu does come down 6 lines down, 5 lines down. Vaksi, the pasuk says, the Amdu Raglav Bayomahu al Har Hazesim, and his Amdu Raglav, his feet stood on Har Hazesim. Says the Gemara, there too Lamala Me'asar Tvachim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Kaviyachol was not actually on the ground; he was above 10 Tvachim. Below Alu Moshe ve'Eliyahu Lamaro. Yeah, they did. These are psukim and these are stories we hear as kids from the Midrashim. Says Gemara, V'aksiv. The pasuk says in Chumash, Moshe Allah Elohe Elokim. It's true, he did go up, but he only went up a little bit. Sorry, it wasn't floating higher than that. It was a little bit. V'aksiv ayal Eliyahu b'sar Hashamayim. That Eliyahu went up in a storm up in the heavens. Says Gemara, Lamata me'asara. Last question. V'aksiv. The pasuk says, Me'aches penei chisei parshes alav anano. Now, in our Gemara, it has the word chisei here with an aleph, but the pasuk is not actually written that way. It's written with a hey. That's quoted here from the pasuk in Sefer Iyov. Me'aches penei chisei. You're grabbing onto the penei, the face of the chisei, of the covering, or as it seems from the Gemara, the chair. And parshes alav anano. He's spreading out the cloud. V'amar of Tanchum milamed. Pires, that he spread out, Shakai, Hashem spread out, Miziv Shechina, so his glory, his Shechina, Va'anano, Alav Anto Moshe. So that means that Moshe must have been near him if he's spreading out. This is actually, the Rashi here says that this is a notricon. The word Parshes, Pires, Shakai, Miziv. That's what Rashi says right here. A notricon is where you have one word that's kind of like just an acronym where each letter is representative of another word. Parshes is representative of Pires and the Pei and the Resh and Shakai and Ziv. Fine, so that's what he says. That's the kasha on the Gemara. So then the Gemara answers 1/3 of the way down. No, Lamata Me'asara. Even there it was Lamata Me'asara. Says the Gemara, no, still. Mikol Makam, the pasuk still says Me'aches Penei Chisei. See, the pasuk still says he was holding on to the chair or he was holding on to the covering, whatever it was, whatever the word is, Kisei with an aleph or with a hey. Either way, Moshe was still holding on to it. Answers the Gemara, you're right, but ishtar buve, ishtar bevle, kise ada sarv nakat be. The Kodesh Baruch Hu lowered and moved the chair down enough that Moshe was able to grab onto the chair, but still he was close to the ground. So this is our question and our answer. We said, how do we know that the minimum rishus for a sukkah, the minimum height is 10 tefachim? The Gemara answers b'kitzer, it's the aron, which is 9 tefachim, plus the kaporos, which is 1, and that is considered a rishus. That is tall enough to be considered a rishus. About 12 lines down, a little bit more, almost halfway down on Hey and Aleph, the Gemara is bothered by something. Bishlama Aron Tisha Dichsiv. I understand that we know that an Aron is actually 9 tefachim. How? Because the Torah tells us what the height of the Aron was. Let's look at the whole pasuk. Dichsiv ve'asu Aron atzei. We're going to make the Aron. It's going to be made out of this type of wood. Amosayim v'chetzi arko. 2.5 amos in orech, in length. Ve'ama v'chetzi rechbo. 1.5 amma in width. And here's our keywords. Ve'ama v'chetzi komaso. And it's 1.5 amma tall. Times 6 tefachim per amma is 9. Good. Ella, what we don't know is how a kapores was ever to reach 1 tefach. The Torah doesn't explicate what that halacha is. We don't know. Ella kapores tefach minalan. After all, the Tani Rabbi Chanina, kol hakelim sha'asa Moshe, all of the utensils that Moshe made, nasna b'hen Torah midas orkan, umidas rachban, umidas kamasan. They were given all 3 X, Y, and Z. They were given the full cubical shape, whatever the shape was, length, width, and height. Except for kapores, but by the kapores, says the Gemara halfway down, midas orka midas rachbanas. Now we know length and width, but midas kamasa lo nasna. So that's the Gemara's question. We know that the Aron is 9. You're under the assumption that the kapores is 1, which then brings us to 10. But how do you know that? The Gemara is going to present a whole host of answers. 3 lines before the wide lines. Seyu lamad. Maybe we can learn this from mi pachos shebekelim, from one of the smallest of the utensils. Shene'emar, the pasuk says, "V'asisa lo misgeres tofach saviv." This is a reference to the shulchan. The shulchan had this trim around it that was referred to as miskeres. Rashi, 5 lines down, miskeres, safa, ke'ein lebazbizin saviva shulchan. It was some type of trim around the shulchan that was decorative maybe, or maybe it was functional as well. We'll have to see in the Gemara. So it says the Gemara, malahalan tefach, afkan tefach, last of the short lines. Just like that, miskeres on the shulchan was 1 tefach. Maybe we should say over here that it's the same exact height by the kapores. Says Gemara, I mean, I guess so. I guess you could learn it from there, but why don't we look at the kli that you're actually building? You're building the aron, learn it from there. V'neilaf mikelim gufayhu. Why are you picking the miskeret? Learn from the aron. Make it an amma and a half. What's with the tefach? Why did you pick a tefach? Says the Gemara, last of the short lines. This is a couple of times we've seen this in Shas already. Tafasta merubalo tafasta muhat tafasta. And here the Rishonim explain as follows. We don't have a shiur for the kapores. So when we go looking for a shiur, our starting assumption is that it should be relatively small. and we should not assume that it's going to be one of the larger shiurim. Why is that the case? Great question. But that is what this Gemara means. Tafasta mubalo tafasta is that we're not aiming big here. We're aiming small. We're looking for smaller things. That's why the first answer of the Gemara is, hey, the miskeres that's around the shulchan, that's reasonable. It's smaller. Good. Says the Gemara, okay, well, if that's true, then says the Gemara, v'neilaf mitzitz. The tzitz also had no actual height measurement. I mean, we made it that way, but the Torah doesn't say it. The Tanya, the Brisa writes, the tzitz that the Kohen Gadol would wear is domek kimin tas shel zahav. It was like a plate of gold. V'rachav bezetz bows, and it was only 2 fingers thick. We normally assume that a tefach is 4 fingers thick, approximately. A tefach shochak is where your fingers are spread out a little bit. Regular tefach is 4 fingers. This is 2, very small. That's how thick that if you just manage it on your forehead. It's very small. If you're the Kohen Gadol, it's very small, very thin. Fine, that's what he says. Umukaf me ozen leozen, and it would extend from ear to ear. The kastuv alav beis shitin, and there were 2 lines of writing. Yud hey milamala, it said Yud hey on top. The kodesh lamed milamata. But Rabbi Lazar disagrees. Amar Rabbi Lazar B'Reb Yossi ani reisi beromi. He said, I was in the vaults in Rome and I saw them myself. The kastuv alav kodesh lashem b'shita achas. I saw they were all on one line. Okay, machlokas and tzitz is what it looked like. But maybe we should learn from the tzitz. Says the Gemara, we cannot learn the height of the kapores to say that it's 1. We cannot learn from the tzitz. Why not? Here's the lumdus of the Gemara, 8 lines from the bottom. Hamid Aleph. Done in kli mi kli. The ain't done in kli mitachshit. I'd rather learn the kapores from the miskeres, which is part of a kli, than to learn the kapores from the tzitz, which isn't a kli, but rather a tachshit. Let's compare apples to apples and not apples to oranges. The kapores is a kli. The miskeres is a kli. The tzitz is not a kli, it's a tachshit. So let's compare the 2 things that are more similar. Let's learn one from another in a logical way. That's what the Gemara says. Oh, okay, fine. The neilaf mizer. Maybe we should learn from something else that, okay, it isn't a tachshit. And says the Gemara, what is a zer? The amar mar zer mashu, they're very thin. Let's take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, 10 lines from the bottom of the page. In the Rashi's inner margin, mizer shel aron, o shel mizbeach, o shel miskeres. They were all over the place, but they were used as decorative in decorative form. And that was just a mashu. So maybe the kaporos was a mashu, right? Says the Gemara, no. Done in kli mi kli. The ain't done in kli mi hechsher kli. Okay, yes, we need the zer. It's a requirement. We need it, but it's only a hechsher. It's not even a tachshit. It's a little more chashuv, but it's not enough to learn from. So says the Gemara, that we need to learn kli mi kli, but we cannot learn from a hechsher kli. Says the Gemara, well, let's go back a little bit then. 6 lines from the bottom. Ihachi, if what you're saying is true, that we cannot learn from a hechsher kli, that which isn't a kli really, but something which is a part of the kli, then, says the Gemara, miskeres nami hechsher klihu. The shulchan was a shulchan without the miskeres. We added the miskeres. So then maybe we should look at it as a hechsher kli and say that it's really not comparable, just like we said by the zer. Answers the Gemara, no, don't worry, miskarto lemata haisa. The miskeres of the shulchan was actually underneath the shulchan. Namely, it was like, if you have like 4 poles, then the miskeres, and then the shulchan goes on top. It was a critical piece of the construction of the shulchan. That's what the Gemara is saying here, is that miskarto lemata haisa. It was underneath the shulchan. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't a hechsher kli. It was a mamish part of the kli. Says the Gemara, okay, ha nicha lemanda amar miskarto lemata haisa. Fine. If you say that the way that the shulchan was constructed is in that way, that the miskeres was a critical part of the build of the shulchan, okay. But if you say the miskeres was not a critical part, it was higher up on the build of the shulchan and not essential, after all, if that is the case, that it's higher up and it's not a critical part of the building of the shulchan, hi hechsher klihu, and then it shouldn't be comparable because then it's just like the zer, which is a hechsher. And the hechsher kli should not be comparable. We want to compare apples to apples and not apples to oranges. So if you're saying that the kaporos is a kli and it can only be learned from a kli, then you can't learn from the miskeres if the miskeres is not a critical part of the building of the shulchan. So says the Gemara, okay, we need to change the rules here a little bit. And the Gemara says 3 lines from the bottom as follows. Ella, done in, what do we compare the kaporos to? Done in davar she nasna bo Torah mida, midavar she nasna bo Torah mida. We have to learn the kapores, not necessarily as rigidly as we were thinking before, from kli to kli, apples to apples, but the apples to apples are different in that we need to learn the kapores, which the Torah gave some shiurim about, length and width, but not thickness. And we need to learn that from something which the Torah gave some shiurim about, but not all of them, like the miskeres. And therefore, says the Gemara, you can't learn from the tzitz and from the zer. There we have no shiurim at all. Shalom nasna bahen Torah mida klal. We have no way of knowing from there at all. So therefore, we can learn from the miskeres. Says the Gemara, 2 lines from the bottom, Hamid Aleph. Rav Huna Amar Mehacha. He says, no, I know that the kaporis is a tefach from a totally different source. After this whole dialogue, we just concluded that we can learn from the Miskeres. Good. But he says, I have a whole different, I'm pivoting now. And now we're not going to say, where does it make sense to learn from? What's apples to apples? He's going to go the Rabbi Shmuel approach of the hermeneutical principles. He's going to pull a Gzeira Shava. Says the Gemara, Mehacha. Al pnei ha-kaporis kedma. That's what the pasuk says about the kaporis. What does the word pnei mean? Face. Nobody's face is less than a tefach. What does that mean? Says the Gemara, the Ema, maybe we should say, Ke'ape de bar yuchni, top of Hamid Beis. This animal was a massive animal. Rashi, top line, Of gadol hu me'od. Fine. He's got a huge face. It's not 4 tvachim. Whatever, however big it is, 10 tvachim, his face is huge. Maybe we should say the kapara should be learned from there. Says the Gemara, no, tafasta merubalo, tafasta mua, tafasta. You can't be aggressive in this measurement, as we've discussed. When there's an unknown in the Torah as to the shiur, we don't go crazy. We are conservative. We're very reserved. We don't go with crazy shiur. So you're comparing the biggest bird on the planet? No, that's not how you make the comparison. Oh, okay, you don't want to go with a big bird? Let's go with a hummingbird. Says Gemara, second line, maybe a tiny bird, this zutar tuva, it's extremely small. It's not 4 tefachim, it's 1 tefach. It's nothing. It's a tiny little face. It's a half of a tefach. You ever see a hummingbird? With it, you could close your hand on a hummingbird. They're tiny. I wouldn't. I'm just saying, in theory, they're very small. You could just, they're so small. Tefach, you're talking centimeters. So says the Gemara, Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, Rav Huna, Pnei Gomar. No, you're trying to figure out what kind of bird. No, you're looking at it wrong. It's not how big is the bird. It's Gzeira Shava. The two psukim are as follows. Ksiv hacha, 4 lines down. Ksiv hacha el pnei kapores, like the pasuk we saw on the bottom that Rav Huna quoted on Ham and Aleph. That's pasuk number 1. Ksiv hasa me'es pnei Yitzchak aviv pnei. Yitzchak was a regular person in his physical stature, and he had a regular face. We assume that at a minimum it is going to be a tefach. Therefore, says Rav Huna, Gzeira Shava, I therefore know that when we say al pnei hakapores, that pnei is like pnei Yitzchak, pnei, and therefore it faces 4 tvachim, and therefore I know the kapores is going to be 4. Is 1 tefach, excuse me. Where did I get 4 from? That it's going to be 1 tefach. Says the Gemara. The neilaf. Why didn't we learn it from another pasuk? I could have asked a question. I could have made my Gzeira Shava from elsewhere. The neilaf mi pnim shel mala, because the pasuk says dichsiv kiros pnei elokim vatirtzeni. The pasuk says the word pnei by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And while we have anthropomorphism as like a method of learning, we don't actually believe that Hashem had a face. Yet the Gemara does learn that we therefore assume that God had a very large face. That's the assumption of the Gemara. Says the Gemara, nope, tafasta merubalo tafasta mua tafasta, same rule again, that when the Torah doesn't give a shiur, you have to be measured in your approach. We cannot assume, therefore, that it was the face, quote unquote, kaviyachal of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That is not the case. And fine. So that's how the Gemara explains this case. Next little piece here. Why don't we learn this out from a kruv? A neilaf mi kruv. Why don't we learn from the kruvim? Because the pasuk there says pnei as well. Dechsiv el hakapores iyu pnei hakruvim. What was the size of the kruv's face? Take a look at Rashi. 6 lines down. Dibra maskel b'nei laf pnei hakruvim. Dezutri mitefach. They were smaller than a tefach. So says the Gemara. We have another pasuk that says pnei. Maybe Rav Huna should have made his Gzeira Shava from kapores to kruvim, and therefore we should assume that the kapores doesn't have to be a tefach; it could even be less. Answers the Gemara. Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, Gemiri. We have a tradition. Ein pnei kruvim pchusim mitefach. If anybody asks you what the size of the face of the kruvim were, the answer is it's definitely larger than a tefach. The Rav Huna nami mehacha gamir. This is a very difficult line to understand. The Rabbeinu Hananel here explains that really what Rav Huna is doing is this is actually the correct pasuk to compare to. So he's actually changing the second pasuk. The first one is al pnei kapores, and the second part that he's learning from, that he's taking the word of pnei from, is this pasuk of el kapores yu pnei hakiruvim. Okay, so then we have our answers. We had answer number 1 that we said on the bottom before Rav Huna, which is that we can learn from the Miskeres because at least it had some shiurim in the Torah, just like the Kaporas. Answer number 2 is Rav Huna, is that we have a Gzeira Shava of some kind. Asks the Gemara, 8 lines down, 9 lines down, my kruv. What is a kruv? What is the language of kruv? Answers the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Abo, kiravya. What is kiravya? Shekain bebavel, korin liyanuka ravya. A yanuka is a child. Like Gir said, the yankasa, a yanuka. Yonek is to nurse. It's a child that has to nurse, a baby. So therefore, says the Gemara, kruv is kiravya, that it's like a child. Amar le Abaye, if that's true, then I'm very confused by the pasuk. Elameata. If it's true that it references a baby, then what does the pasuk mean when it says dichsiv pnei ha'echad, pnei ha'kruvu, pnei ha'sheni, pnei ha'adam, hainu kruv, hainu adam? they're both called kruvim, yet one's a baby and one's an adult. Answers the Gemara, ape rav reveva ape zutre, a larger face and a smaller face, but it's a baby face, right? So this also requires commentary to understand did it look cherubic, like that look of those little cheeks of a baby? What did it look like? Did it look like we're all adult men? Did I have a little facial hair? So l'chora, that was not what it was. It was seemingly a baby face that was larger and a baby face that was smaller. That's pshat in the Gemara. No, it's not. It seems to be either an Aramaic word or the local word of the times there, but it's not in modern Hebrew, for sure not. Yeah. So then says the Gemara, now we're going to pivot a little bit. We have our answers now. We asked the question that we started with today and we got two answers. We asked, how do we know that 10 tefachim is the right amount? And we gave our answers. Fine. Now the Gemara is asking the following. I know you said that 10 is the right number, but our Mishnah seemed to say that it had to be a cavity of 10, right? And that's the minimum that we needed. So asks the Gemara, umimai, almost a third of the way down, quarter of the way down, umimai dechalala asara bar misachacha. How do we know that the void inside the sukkah has to be 10 and maybe that it's 9.9? How do we get this, that it has to be a full 10 underneath, bar misachacha? Maybe we should say it's 10, measuring from the outside of the sukkah and not from the inside. Says the Gemara, Ella mi beis olamim gamar la. We learned that from the beis olamim. We've seen this reference many times already in Shas, a reference to the Beis Hamikdash. What did we learn? Dichsiv. The pasuk says as follows: Ve'abayis asher bana hamelach Shlomo, the house that Shlomo built, not a reference to the whole Beis Hamikdash, but a reference only to the Heichal. La Hashem, that he built for Hashem. What were the measurements of the Heichal? Says the Gemara, Shishim Amma Orko. The Heichal was 60 amos east to west. The Esrim Rachbo, and it was 20 wide north to south. The Shloshim Amma Komaso, and it was 30 amos tall. Let's hold on to the number 30. Uchsiv, we also know that the Torah writes, Komas HaKruv HaEchad Eser Ba'ama. We also know that the Kruv was 10 amos tall. V'chein HaKruv HaSheni, they were both that tall. The Tanya, and we have a brisa that says as follows. Mamatzinu bebeis olamim kruvim b'shlish habayis hein omdin, just like we have in the beis olamim in the Beis Hamikdash, where the height of the heichal is 30 amos, that the kruvim are 10 tall and it's a third. Just like in the Beis Hamikdash, the kruvim stand at a third of the height of the heichal, which is 10 amos of 30. So too says the Gemara, Mishkan Nami kruvim b'shlish habayis hein omdin. The same is true in the Mishkan. Remember what we're trying to prove? How do we know that 10 is an internal measurement and not an external measurement? That the void has to be 10. So says the Gemara, we know the following rule. We know that the kruvim in the Beis Hamikdash was 1/3 of the height of the heichal. The heichal was 30. The kruvim were 10. And in the Mishkan, the same ratio applied. It had to be 1/3. So let's see what the measurements of the Mishkan were. It says the Gemara exactly halfway down Hayamid Beis. Mishkan Kamahave. How tall was the Mishkan? It was portable. They didn't build the same exact huge building like they did. Says the Gemara, Eser Amos. The height of the building, the height of the Mishkan was 10 Amos. Tichsiv Eser Amos Orach HaKeresh. That the boards of wood that they were using were 10 Amos long. Kama Havalahu. If we were to translate the number of 10 into tefachim, what would that be? Well, under the assumption that every tefach is 6, then it's very simple math. It's 10 times 6, shisin pushche. It's going to be 60 tefachim. And what is a third of 60? Tlase or tilse kamahavi. What is 1/3 of 60? Says the Gemara. Esrim pushche. That's going to be 20. Okay. So now we're in the Mishkan. The height of the Mishkan is 60 tefachim. We know that the ratio of the kruvim is 1/3 of the height of that building, which means that the kruvim are going to stop at 20 tefachim. Says the Gemara as follows: Dal asara de aron v'kapores. We know the measurements of the aron and the kapores. Undebatable. No one's going to deny it. They are 10 tefachim. So what's left? Remember, we said we're starting with 60 tefachim of height in the Mishkan, and we know that the kruvim stand at 1/3, which is 20. And of the 20 that's left, we know that 10 is going to be Aaron and Kaporis. What's left? It's the 10 above that, says the Gemara. Pashuluhu Asara. And then says the Gemara, and here's the kicker, Uchsiv, V'hayu akruvim porseichen ofaim lamala, sochachim b'chanfeihem ala kaporis. The wings were up, and sochachin, lamala, they were above that, says the Gemara. Umimai degadfayu, how do we know that the wings, ilave reshayu kaime, how do we know that the wings were above them? Dilma lahadi reshayu kaime, maybe the wings were level with the heads, in which case, the void of the sukkah, the height of the sukkah, internal height, is actually enough. Hold on one second. Is actually enough to, maybe it's only 10 and not 10 plus, right? So that's the question of the Gemara. And I'll answer this one question. I'll come to Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov lemala ksiv. The pasuk says lemala, so we know that the wings were lemala. They were above the 10, which means, therefore, with all of this math, that the height of the Mishkan was 60. We know that the kruvim stood at 1/3 at 20 tvachim from the ground, and we know that there was the Aron and Kaporos were 10 from the ground up. That leaves us to 10 tefach in the middle where the kruvim stood. That's 10, and the sochachim b'kanveim, the wings were above that, and therefore the height of the sukkah internally at a minimum has to be 10. Yes, sir.
The line where it ends off the pasuk, you skip Kare l'Rachman Succah.
I totally did. Absolutely true. Uchsiv says the Gemara, "V'hayu hakruvim porsech nafayim ma'asochim b'chayin v'chem ala kapores kai rachman sechacha lemala me'asara." Thank you very much.
Hashem points out specifically that the Succah.
Yep.
It's called Succah.
Yep, absolutely. The mala me'asara, only when it's above 10. Absolutely right. And then the Gemara asked the question about the wings. How do we know that they were above? The Gemara answered that Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov lamala ksiv, because the pasuk says lamala. Okay, well maybe they were way above. Ve'ema de midle tuva, maybe they were 15 amos up, 15 tfachim above. Maybe they were super high. That says the Gemara, that can't be miksiv lamala lamala. It doesn't have a double language of lamala, just one. So we assume that it just covers over enough to leave a height of 10. Thank you for that. I didn't mean to leave that out, obviously. Says the Gemara 3/4 of the way down. Hanicha, all of the math that you just did works out great. All of the math of the tvachim, where we converted the height of the Mishkan from 10 amos to 60 tvachim. And we said that the bottom third was filled with Aron, and there was 10 tvachim left over for the kruvim. All of that works out great, according to Rav Meir. Hanicha the Rav Meir d'amar kol ha'amos hayu benonios, that all of the amos were benonios, they were medium-sized, namely that they were 6 tvachim. Ella, there was a very unique sheet of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda d'amar ama shel binyan shisha tvachim. I agree with you, Rav Meir, that when it comes to building the building, that every ama is in fact an ama of 6 tvachim. However, v'shel kelim chamisha ma'ikal lemeimar. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, whenever you're building kelim, the measurement of the ama is different. The measurement of the amma is that there are 5 tfachim in an amma. And that changes things because the Torah says that the Aron was 1.5 amos tall. But if you're multiplying by 5 instead of 6, all the math changes, right? If you're multiplying by 6, like we've been doing so far, the height is 1.5 times 6, that's 9, plus the kaporos is 10. But what if you hold like Rav Meir, that by the kalim, our amma is 5 tfachim. So then what's 1.5, not times 6 times 5? It's 7.5 plus the kaporos is 8.5. Says the Gemara, Aron v'kaporos kama havalahu. In this new measurement, when we're saying, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that the kalim are measured specifically with 5 tefach per amma, then tmanya opalga. Then you're only left with 8.5. And what that implies is that pashu lahu, that what's left over is chadsrei upalga. We said that the kruvim will stop 1/3 of the way down at 20 tefachim out of the 60. But if the Aron and the kaporos are only 8.5, that means that from 8.5 to 20, you're left with 11.5 to get to the 20, which means that our sukkah should probably be bigger. That's the Gemara's problem with Rabbi Yehuda. Pashaluhu chadsrei upalga. Ema, should we say, sukkah ata havya chadsrei upalga? The sukkah is not kosher until there's 11.5? Because according to Rabbi Yehuda, kalim don't measure the same way as the building itself. Kalim are with 5 tfachim. And if you do that, then that means that the kruvim were actually taller than 10. They were 11.5 tall. Therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, and with this we will close, Elo the Rabbi Yehuda, you're right. I'm not using these measurements. I can't use these measurements because according to me, Rabbi Yehuda, I hold that when it comes to kalim, that every amma is 5 tfachim. And the math therefore doesn't work because that would then mean that the kruvim would have the space to be 11.5 tfachim, and that's not going to work. So what does he hold? Amar Ela Rabbi Yehuda Hilchasa Gemirila. He has a tradition. This is a well-known Gemara in Shas. Amar Reb Chia bar Ashi Amar Rab Shiurin Chatzitzin Umechitzin Halach Lamosh Misinai. When it comes to certain shiurim, when it comes to chatzitza, making sure that when one goes to the mikvah that there's nothing that's separating their skin from the water. Big shilas about casts, about Invisaligns, about braces, about rings that you can't take off, about hundreds of things that can come up. Stitches are a big shilah in poskim, fine. In all of these cases, they are halacha l'moshe misinai. And tomorrow night, Amir Tashem will pick up with the sugya, starting with shiurim de oraisa on the bottom of Hamid Bays. Wishing you all a beautiful night.